We're talking about the fulfillment of the prophecy that's perhaps the most important prophetic fulfillment in the last 2,000 years. Because what we're really talking about today is an action to move us toward the confirmation of the covenant. Now, the confirmation of the covenant is that prophecy like no other because it has a specific timeline attached to it. When the confirmation of the covenant takes place, it will trigger the final 7 years to Armageddon. Now, think about this. On November the 29th, by the way, the date has now been set. They were vacillating between the 15th and the 29th. I thought they would choose the 29th all along, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But on November the 29th, the Palestinians are going to request from the UN General Assembly that they vote to recognize the statehood of Palestine within 1967 borders with Jerusalem, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Now, if they only get recognition of the Palestinian state as a state, and they do not get recognition of the borders 1967 and also East Jerusalem as the capital, then the consequences will not be so much. However, I know that Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinians, is determined that when they recognize the state, they will also recognize its geographic borders. They probably have to, in order to recognize a state. Can you recognize a state with no land, with no home? I don't know whether that can even be done or not. Nonetheless, the plan is to go to the United Nations on the 29th of this month. Let me give you a little bit of background here. Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas announced on Monday that the Palestinian Authority will present its bid for non-state UN membership despite U.S. and Israeli opposition. Now, I don't think the author of the article said it quite right. What he really meant to say is non-member state recognition. Following talks with Arab League chief Nabil al-Arabi in Cairo, it has been agreed that the request will be presented on November the 29th, Abbas told reporters, calling for support from Arab states. The November 29th date was chosen on purpose, and we're getting ready to tell you why. As it is the anniversary of the day in 1947 in which the United Nations voted in favor of the partition plan. The resolution recommended the creation of two states, one Arab, one Jewish, and granted a small portion of the area under the British mandate to the new Jewish state. Now, let's wind the clock back just a little bit, because November 1947 is only 2 years after the end of World War II. By then, of course, everybody had fully understood the horrible concentration camps of Nazi Germany. The troops had gone in, opened them up, found the people there, skin and bones. It was horrible, to put it mildly. So the sympathies of the world were toward the Jewish people. It had come time to create a homeland for the Jews. So the resolution was placed before the UN General Assembly, and they began to vote to create two states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. Well, the Palestinians were not in favor of this at all, but the Jews were just happy to finally have someplace to call home after 1,878 years in exile, almost 2,000 years. They had been what was called the wandering Jew. So here they were. The world community was voting to give them a small piece of land. Yes, it was small, but it would be home. And so the Jews were in great expectation. Well, the votes came in, and sure enough, the vote was approved to create a Palestinian state and a Jewish state side by side. Well, the Palestinians were rejecting this all along. However, events pushed things forward over the next 6 months or so because the British were determined to withdraw from the area. They were experiencing continual bloodshed, continual conflict. They were caught in the crossfire between the Arabs and the Jews. So Israel and Great Britain announced they were pulling out as of May the 14th of 1948, about 6 months after the partition vote was taken. Well, when they pulled out that day, this triggered Israel declaring independence, because once the British mandate pulled out, it was going to be a free-for-all. There was no one in charge. The Ottoman Empire had been in charge of the area prior to World War I, and then the British mandate took over from World War I until May 14 of 1948. Now that's the day they pulled out. Well, what are the Jews going to do? The UN had partitioned this area for their state, and so they accepted the UN offer on May the 14th, 1948, and declared Israeli independence that day. Well, the Arabs refused the UN offer, and they launched a war against Israel on the next day, May the 15th of 1948. Well, that war raged for about a year, and to everyone's shock, Israel prevailed in the war and actually ended up with more land than the Palestinians had refused to let her have, and more land than the UN had actually allocated her. Not a lot more, but more. So when the ceasefire was declared in 1949, Jordan had come in to fight against the Jewish state, and they ended up in control, occupying what has come to be known as the West Bank, or the occupied territories. And it certainly was occupied. It was occupied by the Jordanians at the time. But the country of Jordan did not include the West Bank. It only included east of the Jordan River. So here we have the Jordanian army occupying the West Bank between the Jordan River and the city of Jerusalem, including half the city. They had the coveted Temple Mount under their control from 1949 until 1967. Well, in 1967, Abdel Nasser of Egypt decided that he was ready to take on the Jewish nation again. He ordered the UN to withdraw their troops, which they did, the troops separated the southern border of Israel from the northern border of Egypt. When the UN troops pulled out, Nasser moved his troops up to the border. Well, Israel saw what was coming, a planned invasion of Israel by the Egyptian army. Furthermore, Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, which were international waters, and it was Israel's access to that part of the world. He blockaded those waters, saying that Israel could not use them anymore, which, of course, was an act of war. Well, Israel, rather than just sit and wait until the Arab enemies about them decided to attack, on June the 5th, their planes slipped out over the Mediterranean Sea, flying very, very low. They caught the Egyptian Air Force by surprise, and they annihilated 90% of the Egyptian Air Force. Well, the war was on. And that's when Jordan jumped into the war, Syria jumped into the war. So Israel is fighting a three-sided war. Egypt in the south, Jordan in the east, and then Syria in the northeast. Well, Israel quickly, as I have said, disabled the Egyptian Air Force, and then turned and fought against Syria, fought against Jordan. The Jordanians fled. Israel took over the Temple Mount, which had been under Jordanian occupation for the last 19 years, and swept all the way to the Jordan River, which had been under Jordanian occupation for the last 19 years. So when the armistice was declared 6 days later, I'm talking about this war only took 6 days. They actually called it the 6 Days War. Well, when this happened, there Israel stood astride of the Middle East. Okay, now, let's back up to where we are today. The international community passed some resolutions back at that time that Israel should trade land for peace, but they were very careful not to say that Israel had to trade all the land for peace, because they understood that Israel's borders as they existed prior to 1967 were indefensible. So the UN said you must trade land for peace, with final borders to be negotiated between the two parties, between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Now, if the UN was mandating that they withdraw to 67 borders. There would be no borders to negotiate. They would be set in stone. This brings us up to what's going to happen 2 weeks from right now, when Palestinian Chairman Mahmoud Abbas goes before the UN on November the 29th to request the granting of state recognition with non-membership in the United Nations. So what's going to happen is they're going to ask, Abbas is going to ask for recognition of the state of Palestine, but he's going to ask them to mandate the borders, which they refused to do in the resolutions that were passed after the 1967 war. Now, the United States is opposed to this, we say. Of course, Barack Obama came out in favor of the 1967 borders, and that caused quite a furor back in, 2011. But now he's sort of backed down on that. Well, here Israel is sitting in the middle of all this. Okay, what are the implications? If the Palestinians win the vote, and it appears that they have the votes to do it, they now have been recognized. Palestine has been recognized as a country by 132 nations. They only need something like, let me see if I can give you the exact figure here. They're going to need somewhere around 96 votes in order to get the recognition, because they only have to have a simple majority, and there are 193 members in the UN. So somewhere around 96 votes is all they're going to need in order for them to be recognized as an official state. Okay, well, once this recognition takes place, especially if it is on the borders of 1967, and also if it recognizes East Jerusalem as the capital, if this in fact takes place. Now, watch this happen. If this takes place, then Israel immediately will be looked on as an occupying power, illegally occupying a neighboring state. It then will become open to charges of war crimes, of other illegal things before the International Criminal Court. Now, that's what's at stake here as the tension builds toward November the 29th of this year.